Hello, everybody, and welcome to a Rural Philanthropy Brainstorm for the Open Door Philanthropy podcast. I'm the host of that podcast and founder of Unfunded List, Dave Moss. We have a bunch of folks joining us live here, and also David is recording this for posterity and also for my own purposes. We are planning a new season of the podcast focused on rural philanthropy, and I plan on rewatching this in the future as I write my question sets. More on that in a moment, but like we do on the podcast, I'm going to dive right into it and introduce the topic, right? I'm not an expert on rural issues or on statistics or anything, so I'll try to keep this very basic. In general, in the US, a lot of people live in the cities. And so, and also notably, a lot of the wealth is concentrated there. So a lot of philanthropy is focused on the organizations, donors, and individuals that live in cities, and also the issues that affect those folks. But it is true that a large number of Americans, 20% of Americans, about 66 million people, according to the census, live in rural areas. I myself grew up in a rural area, and I'm sitting in one right now. I'm in Oakland, Maine. I can see a barn out my window. But I also lived in Washington, D.C. for 15 years, which is a very urban area. And so it's off firsthand that there's different issues there. Our board chair, Margaret Chapman, who's with us today, is from West Virginia, and I'm from Maine. And we're probably the two most influential people in the founding of the organization so far, along with my mother, who are all, right, spent a lot of time living in rural areas. So it's something important to us here at Unfunded List. And in fact, I'm kind of guilty of focusing on big cities as well with the podcast. Most of my guests have lived in large cities, have been in New York or Los Angeles, and working on big city issues. So we're going to do our best to focus up on the rural folks. And to start that off is today's brainstorm. I also want to make sure we do some episodes this year that are globally focused. And it's important to note that outside of the US, it's basically about half the world living in rural areas, over 3 billion people. And so if you're an international donor, then you certainly have to have rural issues on your mind. And many of them do. Largely US focused, the conversation today, and I think probably the season. But we will leave some time to talk about some international rural issues as well. We have some proposals from overseas this year, and one of them even has the word rural in its title. So without further ado, just get to the guests in a moment. Just recap what we're doing here today for some of the folks who just joined. So I have done 5 seasons of the Open Door Philanthropy podcast. I'm currently about halfway through recording season 5, where I'm interviewing giving advisors, professional philanthropy consultants, folks who work at foundations, right? And so far, it's been all people who work for individual donors, which is a fast and growing field here in the U.S. and abroad as well. 50 years ago, I don't think there were any professional philanthropy consultants. Now there are entire firms dedicated to it. So that's the focus this season. I like to do a lot of research, think through. It takes a long time to book guests, right? So plan these things well in advance, right? So once I wrap up season 5, we're going to go right into season 6, which is focused on rural philanthropy. All the seasons are online, available wherever you get your podcasts. Our first season, I just called Open Door Philanthropy. It's sort of our VIP season. I interviewed some kind of big shots that year. Season 2, we did live over the course of a couple of days at a philanthropy conference called Nexus, which was a lot of fun. And actually, I was able to grab some big shots out of the crowd there. It's kind of a fun season. And there's a nice, gentle crowd noise in the background, which is actually quite soothing. And then season 3, we called Season She. I focused on women identifying philanthropists. And again, in fact, found one of the wealthiest women in the South to interview for that season, and a lot of other influential lady donors. And season 4 was on collaborative giving circles and people who do not give alone. As I said, currently doing the Giving Advisor season. And right now we're going to officially launch into rural philanthropy. This will be our first time focusing on that. And with us today, I had it right a moment ago. Eryn, Baldrica-Guy, 1 for 1. And Vichi oh no, Jagannathan?
Oh,
Jagannathan? Like Jonathan, but with an extra on?
yes. Sure. Close enough.
That does make it helpful for me too. Sorry to nothing more American than Jonathan. Sorry to Americanize your name for my purposes, but welcome very much. Both of you work at organizations with the word rural in the name, so I thought you'd be good guests for this brainstorm, and that you'll have some thoughts for it. Welcome as well to all the guests in the audience. Is what we've been doing in the previous sessions. It works quite well. Is if you have a question, even while we're having a conversation, feel free to drop that into the chat. Also, if you just sort of have something to say, feel free. And introduce yourself if you have something you want to pop into the chat or whatever. Feel free to do that. And if it gets important enough, maybe we'll even bring you up on stage. So we're going to go one at a time with you. I'll let you talk about yourselves for a moment. And you're each going to do sort of 3 talking points. First, you're going to introduce yourself, talk about any rural background you have, your childhood, right? Playing in streams and valleys and such, I imagine. And then talk about your organization, where you're working now. And then what is one thing you want my podcast audience to learn about rural philanthropy? Our audience isn't huge, but the vast majority of them work in philanthropy. They either work at foundations, they're giving consultants, or they're fundraisers, professional grant writers, development directors, those kind of folks. All right, we're going to go in reverse alphabetical order by first name. Vichi, can you start us off?
Yeah, sounds good. Hello, everyone. I'm Vichi Jagannathan. I am one of the co-founders of Rural Opportunity Institute. As far as background in rural, so I don't have the childhood memories of the streams. I actually grew up in a sort of suburban community outside of New York, but for the last 6 years, have been living in a community called Edgecombe County, North Carolina, which is very rural, and that is where our organization is based out of. And actually, kind of the origins of that started about 10 years ago when I was a high school teacher in Northampton County, which is also in a rural part of the country, of the state, and just totally fell in love with the connection to community that folks have, the connection to history, the sort of deep relationships that are possible to build in rural. And so I've just loved living there since. I'm like a converted rural fan. So that's been really
cool. Sounds very rural.
Yes. And then in terms of our organization, we are a small startup nonprofit, so full-time team of about 4, and a lot of grassroots community partners. But basically, we focus on bringing people together to heal from generational and historical trauma. And specifically, that often looks like helping different organizations and agencies in the community that support people. So that could be schools, healthcare, police, helping them to better implement restorative and healing practices instead of punishment and isolation, and overall kind of using that to strengthen the health of our community for the long term. And I think one thing that would be helpful for people to know about rural philanthropy is that it's not just about giving more money to rural communities, but I think it's also how we respectfully engage and work with and support communities along their journeys. So very often, I think folks have this idea that there's something wrong with people in rural, or they, are doing it wrong, and we need to show them how to do it right. But in my experience, actually, there are a ton of experts, a ton of wisdom in community members who are living in rural places, and in reality, it's like they've already figured out how to make a lot of things work with way less resource. And so as much as the communities can benefit from philanthropy, I think those of us who give or serve in rural communities can also learn a ton. And it's like by working together, we can achieve more, but it isn't a one way. Like it's a 2-way street. We can do a lot just by showing up and listening and following the lead of folks, and then kind of jumping in with the resources as needed.
Excellent. Eryn. Same three questions. Hopefully, but the answer should be about you.
Yeah, so I'm Eryn Baldrica-Guy. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Associate Director of Grants and Contracts for California Rural Legal Assistance Incorporated, CRLA. And so I work for a statewide legal services provider in California, obviously. And we have field offices all the way up in the far north of California, all the way down to the Mexican border, and then everywhere in between. And a lot of the areas that CRLA serves are rural and then also semi-rural. So I live in Fresno, which is in the middle of California, and it's a fairly large city. It's over 500,000 people, but the county is huge. And if you just go outside the city, you're already going to run into very under-resourced small areas with no public transit. So even people that might live just outside the city limits have no access to doctor's appointments because they might not have a car, there's no reliable public transit, and they can't get into the city. And so CRLA focuses on those areas and provides obviously pro bono legal assistance to the clients in a number of areas. So there's housing, rural health, and employment matters with farm workers often. And we also have programs focusing on reentry. It's like a wide variety of services. And CRLA also provides community leadership development. So doing outreach and then also working with community members to help them understand the circumstances in which they're living in terms of like civic engagement. Who should you talk to if you need a sidewalk and you don't have one? You can go to these board meetings, you can connect with local officials. CRLA will also help small community groups incorporate so that they can apply for their own grant funding and really advocate for themselves without having to go through larger organizations to speak for them. And in terms of a little bit more about my background, I've lived most of my life in Fresno. And then I've spent a lot of time in an extremely rural part of California near Fresno called Madera, which I don't know. I think of it as very rural because there's not even a Target in the whole county. So that's rural to me. Let me see, the last question. What is one thing you want the podcast audience to learn? What I think it's important for the podcast audience to learn is that rural doesn't necessarily meet that strict definition of rural. It could be semi-rural areas. It could be areas with, like I mentioned, no access to transportation. And I think another thing that's interesting to me is that there is no official definition for rural. It's defined by what it is not. It's just, if you go to the Census Bureau, rural is anything that's outside of what they consider an urban area. So it's already kind of defined by a lack. And so I think that sort of sets up the way a lot of people see it, that it's lacking and it needs people from the outside to come in and fix it. But sort of like Vichi said, it really is about building those trusted relationships with the community, seeing what they already have to offer and what they know, and helping them do that rather than coming in with a set agenda and trying to sort of take over.
Excellent. You talked quite a bit about definitions there, and I want to ask a follow-up. So one, you mentioned semi-rural, which I don't think I've even heard before. Is that like a term that you use at work a lot?
Yes, we use it. We use it. I don't know if there is like an official definition that HRSA or the Census Bureau use, but semi-rural is sort of how we think about, I think the official definitions the Census Bureau uses are like urban, rural, and then frontier when there's just almost no one living there. And so most of the areas CRLA serves would include some of those more semi-rural areas that really are not urban centers that have a lot of access, but they might not meet the official definition of rural. We have an LGBTQ plus program. And while we have clients that live in what might be considered urban areas, they're actually very far away from any kind of resources in terms of gender affirming care. And they might have to drive 3 hours just to go to a doctor's appointment. So it's sort of thinking about like the resources in the area and then the access to services where it might be slightly more rural than it might look on paper.
I also, one thing I wanted to mention today was small towns. In fact, in our original, and I may bring it back. I wasn't sure. I was thinking about doing the season small town and rural philanthropy. I decided, right, and I was like, that kind of like maybe they were different enough that they each deserved their own season. But I did see, I think I saw today when I was looking at some numbers that census considers folks living in small towns under 20,000, like it's just the same. You're rural. Is that correct?
That sounds right.
And do you think I should? What do you think about doing a season focused on small town and rural philanthropy versus just rural philanthropy?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, I think it's a more expansive definition of rural because, yeah, there are towns where there might be, there might be 60,000 people in that town, but they have no access to resources. They're very underfunded. It's a huge sprawl situation. So it actually might look very rural because you can't just get across town by walking. It's just, I think that is also urban sprawl kind of contributes to that because there might be areas that are incorporated, but they're essentially rural because it's so spread out.
All right. I grew up in a town that was about 15,000 folks, and I never thought like. I guess the U.S. Census says I was a rural dweller, but I like didn't think of it that way. Like it was, right. We had quite a few services. No Target, but we do have one in our county. I go a couple highway exits. We have Home Depot, and I do remember when Walmart came to town, which is certainly probably going to be something. I think Walmart's something that's going to come up often. It had just opening a store can have devastating effects on a town of 15,000 people. I've seen that right up close. I imagine Target does the same sort of thing. However, I did buy a lot of stuff both those stores. So, thank you very much. We're going to go to. I have some questions specifically for each of you, and hoping to just wrap around some various targets. But going back to Vichi, one of the things I was reading about in the materials you sent was about design thinking and systems thinking in cities. And I'll say the first time I heard both those terms, I was in San Francisco, and the vast majority of times I've heard people talking about those things. I've been in cities. So can you talk to me about applying them? Oh, well, first of all, what are they, and how do we apply them in a rural context?
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of interesting. The first time that I heard of those was also in San Francisco. So, very much so, I think a lot of these sort of innovation practices disproportionately happen in urban places or arose from there. But yeah, at a high level, the idea behind design thinking is it's a methodology I think originally developed in the Bay and towards like products more so. But the idea is understanding the needs of someone before designing a solution for them. So rather than saying, I think these people need this thing, let me make it, it's like you start by just asking them kind of what's their experience and then working with them to identify things that might be helpful. And for a while, it's, been used in like for-profit products, tech, toothpaste, electronics, but more recently has come into social innovation as well. And sort of thinking through when we offer people social services or nonprofit services, a lot of times we don't think about it from their perspective of like, what's the experience? But then those services may be underutilized. We're like, how come no one is using this thing that we're offering? It's like, maybe it wasn't designed in the way that is best for them. And so in that case, design thinking is like understanding things from users' perspective before we just start creating solutions. And systems thinking to me is kind of the other side of the coin. So we can talk to a handful of people and understand their experience, but sometimes it doesn't really explain why that's their experience. So people might say, where I live, it's really hard to access fresh food. So we're like, okay, let's try and create a grocery store that has this fresh food. But there may well be other forces that make it super hard to operate a grocery store in that environment. And so systems thinking helps us zoom out and say, okay, like what are all the different interacting systems and forces that lead this to be someone's reality? And maybe the solution isn't just with that individual, but it's something bigger. Like maybe we need to look at supply chains. Maybe we need to look at economic policy. And so, I mean, I think the combination of the two is what really adds value to rural, because we want to both understand the experience of people living in rural communities, but we also want to understand all the factors that have contributed to that reality over time. And very often, I think there are some bigger forces that perpetuate a lot of the challenges in rural. And then I think in terms of sort of how we've applied it, I think it's actually kind of important to also talk about why it's important to do these things in rural communities. So as you said, as we know, cities, high-tech places, those are usually the hotbeds of innovation. That's where like all the insight is coming from. So when we first moved, me and my co-founder and coworkers first moved to rural North Carolina, people repeatedly said this story about, whenever we are looking for solutions, we have to go to urban places and pay them to teach us how to do something. And then we find out it doesn't really work for us because we don't have transportation like them. We might not have broadband like them. We might, we're more spread out, whatever. It's a totally different context. And so they're constantly having to retrofit things to work for their situation. And one of the, foundational principles of design is that if you design at the margins, then whatever you come up with will work for everybody in the middle. And very often, I think rural communities are at the margins. And so our approach is like, can we flip it? Can we start by designing specifically for the needs of people in rural communities? And then whatever we come up with may well also work in urban because it's like under even more constraints. And so, I mean, to me, I see it as like a lot of rural communities will experience many of the same challenges everyone else will experience, but it will be more severe, perhaps sooner. Things like climate change, COVID, unemployment, like all these things are happening in rural now, and they will likely happen to the rest of the world soon. And so if we start there and come up with solutions and support rural communities, like all of that will eventually impact everyone else.
Yes, excellent. I'm just wondering, like so they first they did that with toothpaste, and they were like, okay, that works. Because it sounds a lot like, honestly, I'm struggling to figure out. I was actually thinking for a minute, like, how does that even work for toothpaste? Do you happen to like how does that work?
Yeah. Well, so like an example for toothpaste, actually, it's so how toothpaste has like a mint flavor, it adds like zero value. So originally, toothpaste, when it's effective at cleaning, has a kind of neutral taste. And when they introduced that, people just didn't do it because they were like, it's like very boring. It's like putting on soap, it's a task. And it was hard to get people to start brushing their teeth. And then I believe it was Colgate who engaged with people to be like, why don't you use this? And found out that people really like if they changed the taste of it, A, people liked it better, but B, there's like some false association where if your mouth is minty, you think it's clean. And so they had this sense that like
It's like medicine too. It makes it seem like doing a like healthy.
Right. So it was like tasteless toothpaste doesn't work, but minty toothpaste works great. So Colgate must be better. So that's like an example of basically being like, why aren't people doing this? It's something about how the product is designed.
It makes me think of, I'm sure this got applied to Tide cold water. Remember when that came out? You can do your wash with cold. I'm sure someone was like, started asking people or looked into the costs of doing laundry. I'm sure heating the water is a big part of the cost, and then figure that out. And we can
Exactly.
that addresses that. Neat. So I'm glad I got to corporate America first.
as many things.
Now catching on for making rural communities, because it does sound quite useful. So another topic, right, and somewhat related there, right? I think to what you're talking about, to to being inclusive of the community and what they actually need, right, is something that has become quite trendy for philanthropic organizations. Fortunately, which I personally have seen, like when I was in DC, it's a lot more foundations there. Got to interact with some foundation association groups, and you would see a really big movement towards two things. One, social justice in general. Notably, the Ford Foundation now talks about social justice as their like primary funding strategy. When I started working as a fundraiser, they did not use those words, which wasn't that. Look how young I am, so it couldn't have been that long ago. I just got to see Darren Walker talk at a conference. It was really cool. And it's amazing that a foundation of that size, giving grants in that many areas, is doing it through a social justice lens. Another thing that a lot of foundations are talking about and not really sure how to work with, right, is, and they'll call it a bunch of different things: equity and inclusion, DEI. Recently, I heard JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I kind of like that one because JEDI, right, including the justice in there. I do see social justice and DEI as like just super. The Venn diagram there is, and now I think of it as overlapping with systems design thinking as well. So can you talk to me a little bit about, and again, DEI, I think probably the first time I heard that acronym was definitely in a city, and I've usually heard that as applied to like city-based organizations and stuff. So you talk to me about that in rural communities, which are sometimes, I think, more homogenous. So I'm particularly interested in how it applies there. I live in Maine, which is the whitest state in the union. So we do, some of our nonprofits obviously have entirely white boards, and that state's 99% white. So like, what did you think was going to happen to our to our nonprofits, right? They are being pretty, like, we do have some new refugee communities in Portland, which is our one city, and the organizations down there are being quite inclusive with their work, as far as I can tell. But anyway, I'd love to hear about your work with DEI in rural communities. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. And I just kind of, to preface, I guess, building off of what you just said, I don't think that all in this aspect, like there's a huge diversity of what rural communities look like. And so I think it shows up many different ways. And so in our case, in Northeastern North Carolina, our community is majority African-American. There is, a smaller community of other, populations of color, and then a minority white community. And so I think that is different than many other parts of the country. But
I'm in a 99% white county.
Yeah, so I think it probably varies. However, across the Southeast, there is a huge swath of communities that look like ours. And so it is definitely a significant issue. I think one of the things that's interesting about Eastern North Carolina and the Southeast in general is that at least there, although the term DEI may not have been used, racial equity has been a tension and a kind of forefront for centuries. And one of the things that struck me the most about coming to Eastern North Carolina was that there is a huge, long history of individuals and organizations who have been working towards racial equity for a long time. And so actually the county, Edgecombe County, that I live in, there's a town called Princeville, little town. But that town is the first town in the United States incorporated by formerly enslaved African Americans after the Civil War. And so you've got folks who still live there now, whose families have been fighting for recognition and independence. I mean, since sort of the creation of towns. And Martin Luther King has delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech in Rocky Mount, which is another kind of, this would qualify as it's like a 50,000 person town amidst a lot of rural surroundings. But he delivered that speech there before he delivered in Washington.
I never knew that. My parents live in Moore County.
Oh yeah.
Pinehurst.
Yeah, they still have they like preserve the auditorium. Yeah.
And from the train, Rocky Mount looks like everyone left.
Yeah, and I mean, there has been actually in the last 10 years or so a lot of positive work to redevelop downtown. So we're seeing some changes there. But if you look back in history, I mean, there have been and there are people that have really been on the front lines of racial equity work for a long time. And so I think one of the things that I realized is uh it's very often said as like, oh, we need to like start talking about this now, or because of George Floyd's murder now we're focused on this. But the people in Northeastern North Carolina have experienced the brunt of what racism has looked like in our country since its founding, and so like they don't need an
I read
event.
proposals, and so many of them start off like because of like George Floyd's murder sparked the energy behind this. I'm almost like, what are you talking about?
Right. Like,
Just going back a little bit, like Eric Garner, the guy who was selling cigarettes, was like years before that. And how did you get not like? How did that not out like? How did one outrage you more than the? I
right.
don't.
And I mean, we can go right Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, Emmett Till. I mean, the women.
Did you just notice the stuff, right? But even long before like the particularly like violent string of police killings, right? The organizations working on this throughout the history of philanthropy in the U.S. Racial justice has been a major focus of philanthropists and fundraisers in the U.S. We've done some like philanthropy history bits with the podcast, and that's I did it. My father's a U.S. historian. I did an episode with him, and that was almost entirely about race. Actually, when we were in the 19th century, that's like what a lot of the a lot of the funding was focused on, particularly during Reconstruction. And you're right. There's going to be a lot of experience there, and that's what I think when it comes to DEI on that issue. You want to be. That's an important thing to be respectful of. I think that's a very good point.
Right. I mean, I think one thing that has been positive is some sectors, because of the recent events, have become more open. So, like schools, law enforcement, a lot of these entrenched systems, I do see an openness, a unique openness. And I think a lot of what we've really tried to do is make sure that as long as that window is open, how are we supporting the leaders who are already there, who've been doing this for a long time, to be able to have a seat at that table, so that it's not like, let's consult with McKinsey's racial DEI arm to tell us how to be, more inclusive police department. Like, how about we speak to the folks actually in the community who have experienced this?
It is the largest, like they're in their new billings, McKinsey and Deloitte, like DEI is like the biggest new I've heard from a bunch of folks who work at both places. I'm like, what do they know about it?
Yeah. And I mean, it's not a bad thing, but
they'll pay them to do anything. That's what they do. They get you to pay them to do anything.
Exactly. And so I think a lot of it is making
sure. Bring Eryn in here.
Mm-hmm.
I have some questions specifically for Eryn, but I also want to hear, if you have thoughts on DEI in rural areas, or even in semi-rural areas, or one thing you said earlier was frontier communities. I can imagine.
Yeah, those are the ones that,
get some of that.
Yeah, the frontier areas are the ones where, most people have not been. I mean, the DEI, I think that is really important, especially when communicating need to foundations and other funders, is that there is often a perception that rural areas outside of cities, are predominantly white. And that really does depend on where you are. So in California, the vast majority of the communities that CRLA serves tend to be as part of the Latino community. And that's something that we definitely see. And so we always try to communicate that. And sometimes I think philanthropy can also might set up systems, but might not think about some of the other aspects that need to be included with serving people. So there does need to be funding for language justice. A lot of the communities that we serve, in addition to speaking Spanish, some might speak indigenous languages where it's extremely difficult to find services in those languages that originate in Latin America. And so I think it's important to not just think about the actual service that's being provided, but all of everything that has to go along with that, to actually get that to the client or to the person who needs the help. And so CRLA has a language justice initiative and a network of interpreters, and does training in that, so that there is not this reliance on like using child interpreters or just people who aren't trained in that or who shouldn't have to be exposed to trauma because they have to interpret for their parents.
Mhm. That's no, yeah. I never even thought about that issue. None of the proposals we've ever read dealt with child interpreters. But yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure that happens all the time, forcing very young children to do it. Sometimes, if you need to, if you're in an emergency situation. All right. California's a big state. It's actually, if it were a country, it'd be a big country, I think, and quite diverse in terms of its population. With some of the, like, in particular, its urban areas are some of the best known, largest in the world. I think usually when we're hearing about, if we're watching a movie that's in California or watching a sports team, right there from the city. But I think most people are aware you got a big, like, that there's a large agricultural sector there, and a large rural area. Recently, I've learned that Fresno is semi-rural. Is that correct?
I think the county is the city.
In Albuquerque, and I was thinking about it recently. So I guess I'm sure Albuquerque's a city,
Mhm.
but there is, like, compared to other cities, it has a lot of
Yeah.
rural stuff happening.
Yeah, lots of agriculture, limited access to a lot of different resources, people having to go to San Francisco sometimes to get what they need in terms of services.
Mhm. I occasionally go to Canada. It's an option for us for healthcare. In fact, at all times, you can, right, go up there and get healthcare, and they're quite welcoming about it. It's kind of hard to believe. But anyway, one of the I was reading is, so you are a first-time evaluator with Unfunded List. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
And earlier today, I went in and just glanced at some of your reviews. I saw you mentioned in one of them that you have raised money in all parts of the state. I assume that means that you've raised money for both urban and rural areas. I wonder if you could talk about, like, from as a fundraiser, what's different.
Yeah. So I used to work for a nonprofit that served Santa Barbara County, which isn't Santa Barbara's not like a major metropolitan area, but it does have a ton of resources, a ton of wealth. And what really surprised me there is that the city of Santa Barbara, which is in the southern part of the county, has just a ton of nonprofits, a ton of funders, um, and the more rural, sort of northern part of the county is extremely under resourced. And it was just when I was uh, there from like 2017 to around 2019 that people were starting to expand, and some of the funders that were funding the city were starting to move up towards the more rural parts of the county. But it had been such an afterthought, even though most of the service workers were probably not able to afford to live in the more urban areas and were having to commute tons of distances, maybe even from outside the county. And I just noticed that because the the wealthier people and the foundation officers, like when they walk around the city of Santa Barbara, they can see issues like, they can see homelessness. And so they want to fund where they can see something. But there might be even more significant, greater need where they can't see that. And so I think it's really about um, illustrating that for funders, because if you're raising money for a large urban area that has a ton of funders, you don't have to describe that need in such detail because they're going to understand it. But if you're raising money for an area where most people don't go, you have to really know your audience and think about any assumptions that they might have and really paint a picture for them about what it is like to be a resident in that community.
Excellent fundraising advice. We are fortunate to have you as an evaluator. Folks that read you should write that stuff down. In the Are you enjoying reviewing proposals with us?
Yeah.
We have, like I said before, I want to talk briefly about the global thing. We did have one. It's like rural community something. I don't know if you've had a chance to get to that, but it is at the Liberian rural issues. Would be neat to hear your cross-cultural thoughts there from one rural fundraiser to another. Speaking of cross-cultural, the immigration's in the news today. I was watching this morning. I don't know. I'm not an expert enough to talk about it, but as I understand, something is an asylum policy is ending, and it will affect immigration quite a bit. California will be affected. I know it's one of the issues that your organization works with. And we have, for the last several years, we've had a lot of proposals and also questions from folks who want to help with the situation on the border. In fact, and I think the record for fundraising in a day on Facebook was for Graces, which is a border organization in Texas. But one of the things I've been wondering about for a long time, right? So something this is a government issue. A lot of it has to be done by government actors. So I am wondering, like today, there's going to be a big change because a government policy is changing. There's not really philanthropists. Once they start doing that, they're not philanthropists anymore. They're lobbyists. So what is the role for philanthropy to play when it comes to the very complicated issue of immigration?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of different factors. So CRLA, we have some of our funding that comes to us through congressional appropriation. And so that comes with certain restrictions.
Sure.
So CRLA, because of that sort of quasi-federal funding that we're getting, we can serve US citizens, people with legal status, or people who might be eligible for legal status because they're the victim of a crime and they could potentially get a U visa, or they're a victim of human trafficking and they could get a T visa. And then also legal permanent residents that we can help to naturalize, we can serve them. And so that does leave the limitation that we can't provide direct legal services to undocumented folks. And I think that's something to think about in terms of rural philanthropy, is considering that philanthropy can't fund everything, and a lot of nonprofits are going to be partially funded by government sources. Think about the different sort of multifaceted layers of immigration support. So just because an organization cannot do removal defense, that doesn't mean that they can't help people gain permanent residency through different kinds of visas. So I think that's something to remember. And then for organizations without those restrictions, that would be something for philanthropy to look into in terms of funding the areas that more government-funded organizations might not be able to do.
Excellent answers. I picked good guests for my brainstorm. I was taking a lot of notes today. I probably would have been more, but I'm gonna watch this later. Do either of you have is there any topics that we did not cover today that perhaps you wanted to bring up? Anything that you think is of particular importance?
I'm just thinking about what Vichi said about sort of the design thinking. And that just reminded me of a situation that my organization dealt with in the past, where there was an extremely rural community with no access to clean water. And that's something in a lot of rural California areas without municipal wells that I think people might not know a lot about, is that there's a lot of contamination in the water, a lot of nitrates. And so my organization helps people with leadership development to address that. But this was several years ago. There was sort of an outside organization that came in and helped to build this very expensive, large water treatment facility to produce clean water for residents. But they never took into account how much these very low income residents could afford to pay. And so the residents cannot afford the clean water. So it's almost like this intervention never happened because they can't afford it. And so I think that's something to consider also, is just like that end user experience being different than the experience of the person actually designing the system.
Are you familiar with the play pumps thing?
I don't think so.
You might not remember. Yeah, I was a little kid when it happened, and it was like Nancy Reagan, I think, and like some other folks like that. And they went to a rural area in Africa. You can look this up. And they installed these like they're like merry-go-rounds, and they were attached to water wells. And because of that, they like didn't they weren't the merry-go-rounds were not fun. It was like very grueling labor to turn them or whatever. And also culturally, they had no idea what a merry-go-round was, and they just got told it's for kids. They thought that meant that like the children were supposed to operate it. And so what they thought they were installing like playgrounds that would also be water wells, right? It would be great for this community, right? And if they had asked anybody in that community, they would have realized none of that was a good idea. And that it definitely makes me think of that. Particularly, I think this can happen in like you can have someone from the city in California trying to fund the rural part of California and missing the mark culturally. I think that's way more likely to happen if you're from Los Angeles and you're trying to fund like rural Uganda, right? And so these issues are all just sort of amplified, I think, when it comes to this. And a recurring theme on the podcast has always been that philanthropists tend to be better at stuff they can see. The only thing I wrote, Eryn, you said they want to fund where they can see something, right? Like right in front of them. Museums are like basically what they're the best at, right? Museums, operas, like symphonies, things like that, because it's like and it is a real thing. They really appreciate, real part of their life, and that they take seriously, right? If the farther away from that they get from themselves that they get, the less effective they get as funders. I think the worst examples of philanthropy are probably in international development to rural areas because of a lack of systems thinking and inclusion. Right. So this is great. You're giving me a lot to think about in terms of guests. If anybody in the audience has questions, feel free to chime in. Margaret, if you want to, you have any questions? We do have a panel right after this one, so I'll have to go in just a moment. I think it'll be great to have you both back for full interviews. I do lengthy episodes, hour-long interviews. We really dive into it. Margaret, do you have any closing remarks? Would you like to take us out?
Oh, wow. The honor. I will say I don't have a question specifically, but I really appreciated the conversation about like semi-rural, what is rural, especially because I kind of rural environment, and then right next door is what's considered very rural in West Virginia, but I come from like more of a city or a small town. But there are some of the same issues too, and I appreciate kind of that definition of what are we talking about here. And then also really framing kind of the story for your fundraising. I think that really is important for this audience, especially like it's hard. We've talked about that a lot on some of the other panels, is how to tell your story and be vulnerable and share so that the person funding really kind of gets, why you need the funding and what they're helping to do. So I really appreciated that piece too, is really put them in the situation, help them understand what the environment is in that rural environment, because they may not have any experience with that whatsoever. So thank you both for being here. This is a great conversation, and it's only spurred more interest for me. And now I want to go read and research even more about rural philanthropy. If I didn't want to already, which I did, now I want to do it even more.
This panel was mostly Margaret's idea, I think, in the first place. Yeah. I said we did have some conversation about small town versus rural, which I think we'll bring back. I think we might be bringing small town back into the mix, which will open up probably some even more issues. There are some questions from the crowd I want to try to get to real quick. One from Christina, who has been evaluating with us for a few years and works for a funder up in Canada. Interesting to hear about the water issues in rural California. Common issue in First Nations communities in Canada, which I've heard. We've had some joint water / border issues in reservations in the U.S., mostly around pipelines and some other things. I do have plans to interview some tribal leaders as we do this. We're lucky, one of our closer advisors is head of the Pueblo Development Commission. She could not be here today because she has a 3-year-old girl who is adorable and not a great guest, unfortunately, for podcasts. Right? Sometime we will hand Salome off to Dylan, and I'll talk to Marina a little bit about funding in the Pueblos which I'm very interested to dive into, and hopefully find some other native guests as well. I think most reservations are classified rural. Also, another one that I'm interested to hear about. Give each of you, I don't know, about a minute. It'd be great to hear just about transportation in both issues. Vichi, talk about transportation quickly.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely face the challenge. I think one thing that has helped, for better or for worse, as a result of COVID and lockdown and stuff, we were able to increase people's ability to collaborate virtually. And so it's made a lot of things easier, like only gathering when we absolutely need to gather. And then I think the other thing is a lot of people have these informal ways of getting around, but it just doesn't fit into the usual like paradigm we're used to, like taxis and public transportation and stuff. So very often, if we are expecting people to travel, we offer them a stipend that can help them arrange. Like a lot of times it's like paying a friend for a ride, or they have their kind of creative ways of doing stuff that just doesn't fit with how we think about it. So just making sure we're compensating people to be able to find their way around while we're waiting for the infrastructure to catch up.
Excellent. Eryn, anything on transportation?
Yeah, that's CRLA actually has a program called the Community Equity Initiative that works with residents of rural and unincorporated and disadvantaged areas and helps them advocate for things like transportation. They'll often help them understand, okay, you can go to the Council of Governments in this area, and they're the ones that decide where the bus lines go, because sometimes the people setting up the bus lines really, they don't take the bus. So they don't know where it needs to go. And so that's always a victory when that team is able to work with the community and get a new bus line added or a new route or a new time, and people are able to get where they need to go. I mean, there might be issues where people are getting evicted because they can't get to court because there's no bus line that takes them to court. So I think it's about getting in front of the decision makers with the community and then letting the community make their needs known to the decision makers.
Excellent. I think we can keep going. And I look forward to talking to you both in your own episodes of the podcast. Susan commented here on rural electric cooperatives, which I'm very interested to talk to you about. This is actually, I'm currently getting a heat pump installed. I just made it through my first winter since I moved back to Maine. And my January bill is the most I've ever paid for any one bill. Because it's expensive to heat things here, and also if you don't, you will die. So yeah, I've written down a note to follow up with you. Our next session is common grant proposal questions, and I am not moderating that one, so you will not have to listen to my voice much more. We have some really talented grant writers who are going to go over some standard questions from grant proposals. So feel free to hop over there. Thanks everybody for attending. Thank you to our guests.